The next morning, Anne told Marilla that she had named many plants, such as the cherry tree outside her bedroom window, which was covered in white blossoms and named the Snow Queen, and a geranium she named Bonnie, so it wouldn't feel sad. Marilla had never seen a child like this before. Anne's strange fantasies were beyond her understanding. Marilla was very reserved and practical. She didn't believe that imagining things differently from reality would be of any benefit, so she was a very serious person. However, unknowingly, Anne's joyful spirit and marvelous imagination had begun to affect Marilla. Marilla found herself thinking, as Matthew said, she is indeed interesting. I'm even starting to wonder what she will say next. She might charm me. But this small ripple was not enough for Marilla to decide to adopt Anne, so Anne had to set off. She cheerfully climbed onto the carriage, ready to return to the orphanage, saying, "Although I'm a bit disappointed, I'm looking forward to the future even more, because just hoping is enough to make me happy. You see, this child is always cheerful, as if nothing could defeat her, like magic." On the way back, Anne told Marilla about her past, what she had been through since birth, and Marilla felt a pang of sympathy as she listened. However, Anne herself did not complain about the unfairness of fate. Instead, she empathized with others' difficulties, facing everything with optimism and kindness. This made Marilla feel compassion for Anne. She thought, this child talks a lot, but she can definitely be corrected through education. She will become a polite and refined person because her parents were proper people. Notice that although Marilla lived in poverty, was not very social, and seemed unapproachable, she was very kind. She could see through Anne's heart and respect the pure qualities of this little girl. So when she found out that the middleman was going to send Anne to another place where the lady was irritable, mean, and unkind, Marilla couldn't bear it. She finally made up her mind to adopt Anne and keep her at Green Gables. This red-haired girl, who had been abandoned time and again, had finally found her home by a twist of fate. There's a saying, when the environment turns with the mind, joy comes. When the mind turns with the environment, distress comes. You can't change fate, but you can choose your attitude towards it. Anne's optimistic spirit is a catalyst for all beautiful relationships. Anne stayed at Green Gables. Could she adapt to life there? Marilla assigned Anne various tasks and observed her closely. She found Anne clever and energetic, but her biggest flaw was her tendency to daydream during work, indulging in fantasies and constantly getting into trouble. This was Anne's characteristic. The news of the siblings adopting an orphan quickly spread in the town. A Mrs. Lynde, who loved to be in the know, rushed to Green Gables out of curiosity to meet Anne. Upon seeing the little girl, Mrs. Lynde was very rude and bluntly said, "Why is she so ugly? So thin and bony, with so many nasty freckles and hair as red as a carrot." Anne was very angry when she heard these words. She shouted hysterically at Mrs. Lynde, "I really dislike you for mocking me. I've never seen anyone so vulgar, rude, and impolite as you." Marilla, shocked, stopped her. "Anne!" But Anne, holding her head high and glaring with eyes as fiery as flames, clenched her fists and faced Mrs. Lynde fearlessly, saying in great anger, "Some things, even if you know them yourself, you still can't help but wish others didn't think that way." "Anne, go inside," Marilla scolded. Anne burst into tears and ran back to her room. Mrs. Lynde was greatly surprised and said, "Adopting such a child must be quite a trial." "But what did Marilla say?" "She said you were a bit harsh just now." Mrs. Lynde awkwardly stood up and left with a swish of her sleeve. Marilla went to find Anne, who was still crying. Marilla tried to console her and hoped she would apologize to Mrs. Lynde. Anne, however, was very stubborn. I will never apologize to her." Marilla couldn't persuade Anne and felt quite frustrated. But thinking of Mrs. Lynde's stunned expression, she found it rather amusing and let out a laugh. The next morning, Anne still refused to admit her fault and wouldn't eat breakfast. Matthew brought the breakfast to persuade Anne, saying, "I know you don't want to apologize, but Anne, can't we just put this behind us? Go say something to resolve it properly. What do you think?" Actually, Matthew was simply advocating the ability to move on, suggesting that any issue should be properly resolved and put behind us. Anne thought for a moment and said, "If it's for Matthew, I'll give it a try. I admit my mistake now." You see, this is the power of love and understanding, which made this little girl soften, no longer bristling like a hedgehog. When she decided to apologize, she didn't hide her feelings at all, saying, "I am so sorry that even if I used up an entire dictionary, I couldn't express my inner sorrow. Think about it. Not only did I treat you with extremely harshness, but I also embarrassed my dear friends, Matthew and Marilla. Even though I am not a boy, they still let me stay at Green Gables. I am truly a terrible and ungrateful girl who deserves to be punished and forever scorned by righteous people." Upon arriving at Mrs. Lynde's house, Anne extended her hand sincerely. "I lost my temper because you spoke the truth, which was very wrong of me. The fact is, every word you said is absolutely true. I have red hair, a face full of freckles, skin stretched over bones, and am very unattractive. Although I was speaking the truth to you, I shouldn't have said it that way. Mrs. Lynde, please forgive me. If you refuse, I'll be heartbroken for the rest of my life." It was very childlike, but very sincere. Mrs. Lynde, hearing this, quickly said, all right, get up. Of course I forgive you. It's my fault for speaking so bluntly. Don't take it to heart." You see, is Mrs. Lynde a bad person? Not really. Through this incident, Mrs. Lynde changed her view of Anne. She privately told Marilla, "This child is indeed peculiar and special, but not unpleasant. You've been fortunate to adopt such a kind and smart child. Living with such conscientious and kind-hearted people as you, she will surely take a turn for the better." And Anne, she also learned an important lesson. Apologizing isn't as scary as it seems. How we handle our mistakes ultimately determines how we interact with others. So, under the care of the kind-hearted Matthew and Marilla, Anne became happier and warmer. She was like a beam of light, winning the affection of others and adapting to life at Green Gables. Unlike her previous foster family, Matthew and Marilla did not see Anne as just someone to help with chores. They cared for her wholeheartedly, hoping to give her a warm home and nurture her character and manners, as well as provide her with a good education. Although the siblings were not financially well off, they still supported Anne in going to school. Thus Anne began attending the local Avonlea school. The girls had heard about her and were very curious. Anne also made a good friend at school named Diana. Diana lived very close to Anne, and the two girls are congenial, vowing hand in hand. "As long as the sun and moon exist, I will do everything to be loyal to my best friend." This is the power of friendship. Hand in hand with her best friend Diana, walking to school, Anne would say, "What a wonderful day. Isn't it great to live in such a day? I really pity those who haven't been born yet, because they miss out on this day. Of course, they might have other good days, but they won't have today. With such weather, it's even better to walk to school, don't you think?"